We're joined now by Dave Boucher. He's the government and politics reporter over at the Detroit Free Press with a lot going on at the state and federal level right now. We're pleased to be joined by him. Dave, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. So over the weekend, the U.S. Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, was in Metro Detroit, and on Saturday she was quoted when speaking about the Build Back Better plan, saying that it's mostly complete. It's about 90% of the bill is written. Some harsh decisions, quote unquote, need to be made, but that a deal could be struck as early as, well, she said as early as Monday, but realistically at this point, because we're past Monday, sometime this week. Where is that plan in the process? Is there a chance that that bill could be passed at the federal level this week?
Yeah, that's right. She told us at this event that she thought that they were 90% of the way there and that they had the concepts in place, but there's a difference between understanding concepts and actually having a piece of legislation that is ready to present and vote on. So she essentially said the same thing on national TV on Sunday. It sounds like at this point, the timeline is closer to something happening this week. And keep in mind, there are two separate pieces of very large, very complicated legislation that are kind of intertwined in this. There's this so-called Build Back Better plan, which is essentially investing trillions of dollars over a decade into all sorts of social programs, be it pre-K, potentially community college, childcare, all sorts of other things. Then there's a separate more than $1 trillion over 10-year infrastructure bill that would invest lots of money into water infrastructure, into roads, highways, that sort of thing. So all of that is connected. The fates are connected, frankly, because of disputes in the Democratic caucus and trying to get more versus how much they can actually pass in the Senate. But it does look like, according to the Speaker, that there could be votes on both of those bills in the House this week.
And Dave, at this point in time, has there been any indication where those compromises have been made on this bill, particularly in the Democratic caucus, which has the majority in both houses at the federal level, but there seems to have been that divide, particularly among some of the more quote-unquote moderate Democrats, most notably so Joe Manchin from West Virginia and Kyrsten Sinema from Arizona. Where have some of those compromises maybe been made that have made this be at a point where Speaker Pelosi can say it's really close to being at a point where it could pass?
Yeah, it's honestly hard to know, right? These negotiations are happening behind closed doors. And one day you read that, for example, there was a proposal to have expanded free community college, and that might be off the table. There are questions about childcare incentives that might be off the table. There are questions about how aggressive the so-called Build Back Better plan will be in terms of climate change. Again, it's really hard to speculate until we actually see the legislation. A lot of the discussion has been around the price tag, which can be super confusing. There's talk that Senator Manchin doesn't want a bill that would cost $3.5 trillion. Again, that's money over 10 years, but it's unclear specifically, where he or others might want to cut. As you noted, some of the debate has gone on within the House Democratic caucus, and that's between so-called progressive Democrats like Rashida Tlaib or Andy Levin here in Michigan, who want everything that President Biden promised, be it free college or any of those other measures we talked about, that would cost more and potentially would be dead on arrival in the Senate. And so House moderate Democrats, so-called moderates, are trying to find a plan that would actually pass in the Senate, that would actually gain support. Again, it's hard to speculate on what that might entail until we actually see it. We anticipate we might see something this week.
We're joined by Dave Boucher, government and politics reporter over at the Detroit Free Press, joining us today on the Megacast. And also this week in Michigan, Governor Whitmer recently named a new director of the Unemployment Insurance Agency. That will be Julia Dale, who will take over the agency from the interim director. And as we continue through the pandemic, and even as the the increase of unemployment claims has waned significantly in the past several months due to extended benefits being withdrawn at the state level, and of course people returning to the workforce as well. There still is continuing issues there. She's coming in with a really tough task ahead of her. What indication do you have, or does your team over at the Free Press have at this time for the new director Dale, and what her priorities are? Because there's so much to fix there at the UIA, and there's obviously a lot of pressure and oversight on that agency right now because of the issues that have been seen over the pandemic and the known issues from before the pandemic.
Sure. So I'll say that we found out this information the same time as everybody else did, and I think it's a little bit unclear exactly what specifically Ms. Dale will want to do first versus, short-term, midterm, long-term goals. As you've noted, Republicans, Democrats, the governor, everybody has kind of indicated that the unemployment insurance agency and just unemployment in general isn't working. It's a system that is convoluted, complicated, sends out too much money to some people, not enough money to other people, or is very late in sending out money. There's a lot of consternation earlier in the pandemic when the governor essentially asked the then head of the agency to step down, and it was confirmed that he received a roughly $86,000 separation agreement, so paid to essentially to go away. So there's been a lot of consternation. Republicans have called on the who had been the acting director of the agency to step down, Liza Eastland Olsen, to step down. They had argued that, again, that she had not done anything to kind of alleviate this bureaucratic quagmire. And so I think that there is a push, obviously, by the state to move on, to try and find ways to again, make this easier for people who really do need these benefits. I will note, you brought this up, there were extended unemployment benefits that were made available through federal funds. They're no longer available as of the start of September, but Michigan's unemployment rate declined only slightly in September, dropping to 4.6% in the month. That's compared to 4.7% in August. So there's an argument that those enhanced federal jobless benefits didn't actually relate or cause this massive surge of people who had allegedly been waiting on the sidelines to come back into the labor force, if not for that funding. So again, that could be a process that takes a little bit of time, but we've all heard about employers who are begging for people to come in and work. And we've heard that there's this idea or this concept, chiefly, driven by Republicans, who've said that people aren't working because they have this financial disincentive not to. And that just hasn't borne out yet in the data that we've seen.
We're joined by Dave Boucher. He's a government and politics reporter at the Detroit Free Press, joining us today on the Megacast. And Dave, another issue at the state level is the situation with the water over in Benton Harbor. The Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy's Director Clark has kind of been, and as your article's headline says, kind of been waffling on identifying the safety or unsafety of the water there in Benton Harbor. This was an issue, a crisis that was first identified in 2018, but really until recently hasn't been getting a whole lot of focus, at least not in the news and in our political centers. What took so long for this issue to finally come to the forefront and ultimately made this such hard-hitting news and important news here in the Michigan news cycle?
Yeah, that's the $20 million question, right? That's essentially how much money the state and local officials believe they'll need to replace all of the lead water pipes in the city of Benton Harbor. The state would argue, and I would think that the EPA and others might too, that there was a reaction, arguably in real time. However, the efficacy of that reaction and just the related effort by the state is what's in question here. There was testing by the state that was done on the water. There were efforts to add what's called an anti-corrosion agent, a chemical that's put into the water that's supposed to stop the pipes from corroding, and that's what kind of makes that lead come into the water. And it just didn't work. And the state tweaked the formula and waited months and months and months, and it didn't work again. So there are a lot of questions about what's going on in Benton Harbor as in terms of that water. Again, no amount of lead in water is safe. And yet the head of Eagle, the department you mentioned, didn't directly say, at least initially, that the water was unsafe to drink. She did eventually, and she noted that the state is handing out water bottles, but they didn't start doing that essentially until October or late September. Activists believe that they were spurred on to do this because of a petition filed with the EPA that essentially called on the EPA to intervene, alleging that the state hadn't done enough to act. So the state has pledged a ton of action since then, but there are questions that remain about whether or not the department or the legislature or the governor could have done more in the meantime.
And on a human front, obviously this is a significant issue for the people of Benton Harbor. You think about the parallels between this issue and of course the Flint water crisis that marred the previous administration. This being that it was first identified in 2018, that's within that window of Governor Whitmer's administration, and so that brings us to kind of transitions into election season, as we've seen recently reports on campaign finance for Governor Whitmer, as well as for competing candidates like James Craig, and these numbers are staggering, especially Governor Whitmer's numbers, as she has more than double or tripled in some cases the campaign funding so far as that of her opponents. Being that some of these opponents like James Craig are already bringing in some of these significant funds, is money in politics in the state of Michigan going to become a bigger issue during this gubernatorial race because of the staggering funds we're seeing come into these campaigns already at this early stage of the race?
I'm not sure that money in politics could be a bigger issue than it is already. It's a massive issue. Depending on who you talk to, it's a massive problem. And as you know, the governor's brought in millions of dollars. I think she reported more than $3 million. The Craig campaign reported more than roughly $1.4 million. Whomever the Republican candidate is for governor will not be lacking for funds, right? Like obviously Governor Whitmer, who's an incumbent, has a pretty baked in advantage here and has been raising funds for a while. She's very popular with the Democratic base. But whomever runs for as the Republican, whoever earns the nomination, will have a ton of funding as well. This is a national race. There's national implications. Republicans think that this seat is ripe for picking. So yeah, Michiganders should be ready to be inundated with TV, radio, and digital ads. You know, if they aren't already, it's going to be starting soon.
We're joined by Dave Boucher. He's the government and politics reporter at the Detroit Free Press, with us on the Megacast. And as we go into election season, as we continue in this early stage of the election season, nationally and at the state level, voting rights has been arguably the biggest issue in this current cycle, really since the end of the 2020 presidential election, with all the unnecessary and just overall ridiculous continued contesting of that result that's been confirmed time and time again. On one side, we're seeing some new laws being proposed particularly by the GOP for tighter restrictions at the polls, for greater voter identity laws being put in place, more restrictions or more requirements for people to be able to prove who they are when they go to the polls. And on the Democratic side, more of a fight to prevent those laws from going through and expand the access to the polls for those that are eligible. Governor Whitmer recently vetoed a bill that would change the responsibility of clearing dead voters from the qualified voter file from a city and from municipal clerks to county clerks. That doesn't seem like that major just of an issue on this front from the outside looking in, for people that maybe aren't so familiar with the process of this. But why was this such a pervasive proposal to Governor Whitmer to the point where she vetoed this bill?
Yeah, so I would argue that the governor's rationale was a little bit vague on that front, and argue to put an undue burden on clerks. So what you're talking about is right now there are local, like municipality and city clerks, and there are county clerks. And although the city clerks, municipal clerks run elections, the county clerks are the entities that have the information about voting rolls and about who's dead. And so like right now, there's like the left hand has to talk to the right hand in order to make sure that people who have died are removed from the voting rolls. So there was testimony from Barb Byram and other Democratic clerks who said actually giving more power to county clerks to kind of clean up these rolls would be a good thing. So I talked with her after the veto, and she indicated that she didn't know exactly why the governor did it, but she trusted the governor's rationale. I think it's fair to say that right now the governor appears to be aiming to veto all the voting-related legislation presented by Republicans, some of which, as you and many others have noted, would, according to activists and many others, restrict the capacity to vote or put undue harm or burden on people to vote. You mentioned voter identification. It's worth noting that Michigan already has a voter identification law. You are required to bring a photo ID to the polls if you want to vote. However, under current law, if you don't have that ID, you're able to sign an affidavit, right? So Republicans argue that that system allows people to come in without an ID and sign this affidavit and potentially commit fraud. There's really no evidence that that's an issue in the state. The Free Press noted after the previous election that more than 99% of voters in the November 3rd election presented an ID at their polling place. So there were only a roughly 11,500 affidavits filed. More than 5 million people voted. So people are already showing IDs. The Republicans have argued that this is necessary to, even one allegation of fraud is too many. That's their argument, and that this is necessary to close down this potential loophole. Democrats and many others argue that this would prevent people who are elderly, can't provide birth certificates, who forget their IDs, or other people who they would argue are typically disenfranchised or may actually vote Democratic more often from voting in person.
We're joined by Dave Boucher, government and politics reporter at the Detroit Free Press. Dave, just another minute or so with you today before we'll say goodbye. What are some other key issues right now, or issues that are growing at the state level that people should be keeping an eye out for, or will be hearing more about in the coming weeks and months? There's
a story coming out today. The Detroit News reported it last night, and I reported it a little bit further this morning. The Ingham County Prosecutor's Office is not going to charge Representative Steve Marino with stalking in relation to text messages that Representative Mari Manoogian, a Birmingham Democrat, said that she received from him. The pair had a relationship. They broke up. Representative Manoogian accused him of domestic abuse and sending threatening text messages where he said that he wanted her car to explode. The prosecutor, I spoke to the prosecutor this morning. She told me that they received presentation of the case for stalking from the Michigan State Police, who had been investigating, but that her office couldn't prove those charges beyond a reasonable doubt. So it's unclear exactly how that affects Representative Marino's standing in the House. He'd been removed from all of his House committees. He's allowed on the House floor, but not been voting. So we're going to try and see what happens today and in the immediate future.
Well, Dave, we appreciate it. Thanks for joining us, telling us more about some more details about a lot of these key issues and giving us some more insight on what's coming on the docket pretty soon and things we should be keeping an eye out for. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.